this works. As Erica said, I teach in International House Madrid, and I also coordinate extracurricular classes for students in schools. I just want to say that I can't see the chat while I'm presenting, but I'll have a look afterwards if you have any questions. So my talk is Busting Myths of Autism in the EFL classroom. And first I wanted to check some wording that I'm going to be using. So autism was known as, higher functioning autism, Asperger's, and then you also had perhaps moderate or severe autism on the lower end of the spectrum for people being able to perform stereotypically, socially, you know what I mean. Now we're talking about ASD, which is autism spectrum disorders. However, there are many in the community who much prefer the term autism spectrum conditions as a way of representing, not a disorder, but a difference. And you will see in the literature sprinkled throughout autism, high functioning autism, Asperger's, ASD, ASC. It's really quite confusing at the moment, but I think the most important thing is to ask the people themselves. And in the community, especially online, you're going to see a lot of people who much prefer to call themselves an autist and would prefer to refer to this as a disability because they would like the recognition of how difficult it can be for them to fit into a world that might not be made for them. Either way, we're talking about a difference, no? And in this conversation, we're often talking about neurodiverse people. So neurodiverse being the people who react with society in a different way in terms of sociability, people who have differences that are noticeable in the classroom, people who may have differences in attention. Often we talk about ADHD, ADD, but this can be a difficulty for many, many different conditions under the umbrella term of neurodiverse. Mood disorders or mood issues can also be quite problematic or difficult for people. And finally, other mental functions in general. So when we say neurodiverse, it's an umbrella term under which autism falls. This is in contrast to neurotypical. Neurotypical people are basically described as people who are not displaying or characterizing any of these previously mentioned neurologically atypical patterns of behavior or thought. In fact, many definitions of neurotypical use this example sentence. Neurotypical individuals often assume that their experience of the world is either the only one or the only correct one, which was interesting, I thought, when considering this talk. Now, in this talk, I'll aim to answer 4 questions and dispel 6 myths. So the questions are the following. Why are we talking about this? What is ASC? What does it look like in a classroom environment? And how can it be considered a strength? And do stick around for all the myths or try to spot them. So first of all, why? Why are we discussing this? Well, expert on learning styles, Professor Rita Dunn says, if the child is not learning the way that you are teaching, then you must teach in the way that the child learns. So this struck me as an educator because I think anyone who's attending this seminar or this conference or who has been attending during the day, that's what we want to do. We want to teach in the way that can be most beneficial for our students, and discussions of learning differences have led to the understanding that we have to adapt in certain ways when we come across certain kids in our kids, I say, because that's what I'm mostly talking about, but certain learners in our classroom. So this struck a chord in me, and I decided to put together a survey of teachers and their experience of students with autism in the EFL classroom. 92 people were nice enough to respond, and of the 92 responses, 85% disagreed or strongly disagreed that they had received sufficient advice or training on autism from their school, academy, or manager. This in fact rose to 91% when talking about EFL courses such as TESOL or CELTA. But this surprised me because 67% of people said that they were certain that they had had a student with autism in their classroom. And 57% went on to say that they believed that they had noticed an increase in the prevalence of conversations about ASD in the past few years. I feel these statistics clearly show that teachers feel under-equipped to do what Professor Rita Dunn said, teach in the way that children learn. And especially looking back at that example sentence for neurotypical, often people don't even know that they're not noticing differences because they're within their own realm of neurotypical thought. So let's talk about what autism is. Now, this is severely cut down from presentations I've given before, but there will be further reading. Please don't panic. And if you miss anything, don't hesitate to message me at any time by email. I'll give my email at the end. So what is this? Individuals on the autistic spectrum are said to experience difficulties with social communication and interaction. They are said to exhibit repetitive behaviors and specific or restricted interests. They may have different reactions to sensory input. Now, sensory input can be classed as light. No, it's too bright in here. It could be noise. It's too noisy in here, which may not be quite as bright or as noisy as you imagine. They may have quite a low bar for that difficulty. But it could also be things like touch, crowding, space, and surprisingly, sensory input can be too much or it can be too little. So it's important to consider, and that's in my further reading. And finally, people on the autistic spectrum are usually said to have difficulty dealing with change. Now, here comes my myth number one. Autism is on the rise. There has been some concern in developed countries that the number of diagnoses of autism have increased in the past few decades. However, doctors, scientists, and experts in the field attribute this to improvements in diagnostic tools and recognition in the medical community. And it must be said that parents of autistic children and also adults who receive a diagnosis later on in life say that this diagnosis actually takes a weight off your shoulders. It explains so many things. Especially adult diagnoses, they do often comment on how it explains a lot of things from their childhood. So, how frequently does this occur in the population? The National Health Interview Survey in the US, in a study of children and adolescents from 2014 to 2016, found that the prevalence was 2.47%. That was 3.63 in boys and 1.25% in girls. In many earlier studies, and you may have heard of this, there was definitely a greater difference seen in the ratio of boys to girls. However, there have been many changes in the past few decades. Remember, autism diagnosis is in living memory. And due to these changes in recognizing how autism presents in girls and women, this ratio has been lowered to 4:1. Interestingly, in twin studies where one twin has been diagnosed with ASC, it's 90% likely that their twin will also be diagnosed. If you have a sibling with a diagnosis, you're 25% more likely than a random member of the public to also get a diagnosis. And people with family members on the autistic spectrum will tell you that it's usually not just one. And personally, from my experience, there can be several people presenting in very different ways along the autistic spectrum within the same family. Now, at what age can we notice signs of ASC? Parents often notice signs during the first 3 years of their child's life. And as I said before, it's extremely important to point out that adult diagnosis is far from uncommon. Now, this brings us to myth number 2, that autism is caused by vaccines. I'm going to do something now and try to play a little video to prove even better than I could say in the time afforded that this is completely untrue. But please do tell me if you can't hear what's going on. This is obviously John Oliver on Last Week Tonight.
And much of the fear surrounding vaccines stems from their supposed link to autism. Now, that is a theory that gained traction in the late 90s thanks to a study published in the medical journal The Lancet, suggesting a link between autism and the MMR vaccine. The study was of just 12 children, and it was by this guy, Andrew Wakefield. And if you're wondering why I didn't say Dr. Andrew Wakefield, this is why.
Follow-up studies of hundreds of thousands of children could not find any evidence that the MMR vaccine causes autism. And investigations into Wakefield's original paper revealed he distorted the data and acted unethically.
He's lost his medical license. The Lancet paper has been retracted.
It's true.
It is true. Do look into it because it's an interesting story, but never, perhaps never, has such a tiny study had such a damaging effect in terms of learning differences, at least. But there are studies that are peer-reviewed. There we go. There are studies that are peer-reviewed. Many studies, for example, have documented the co-occurrence with other issues or other differences. Anxiety, depression, unfortunately, and ADHD or ADD are common. In fact, one study reported that 25% of people presenting on the autistic spectrum, in fact, had ADD or ADHD as well. So much so that doctors actually, when diagnosing autism or ADD, ADHD, do a test for the other. Genetic disorders are rather common. Epilepsy can be possible, and very interestingly, increasingly, links are being found with questioning gender identity, especially in the community that likes to refer to themselves as Asperger's. Now, we've been talking a lot, or I've been talking a lot about this autistic spectrum, but people on the spectrum themselves have recently been voicing their irritation with neurotypical people, saying things along the lines of, we're all a little autistic, it is a spectrum, or I'm not autistic, but I'm definitely on the spectrum, demonstrating that they have no concept of what a spectrum is. They are perhaps considering a range. Spectrum is much more complex and interesting. In the context of autism, a spectrum is often used to discuss the manifestations of different conditions of someone with ASC. And people with autism can differ hugely in their individual strengths and weaknesses in some or all of these following areas in what's known as the mosaic phenomenon. So we have here pragmatic language issues. This would be the typical not understanding what everyone else is getting in this conversation. Social awareness, this would be, for example, saying things that might seem inappropriate in a context. Monotropic mindset, this would be specific obsessions or specific interests. Information processing, this is the tendency to see patterns or the issue with change. Sensory processing, as I said before, we could have hypersensitivity or hyposensitivity to stimuli. That's the not enough stimuli. And this is often demonstrated in the issue with touch, that a lot of people on the autistic spectrum may have a difficulty with touch, but at the same time may use weighted blankets to sleep. So this is quite a tricky one in some ways. Repetitive behaviors, it says here tendency to stim being, which I'll explain later, a physical response to perhaps stress or something happening. And then finally, neuromotor differences. This is ability to control your body movements that might be different from a neurotypical person. Again, people may have a small number of these issues, all of these issues in noticeable ways or not so noticeable ways. That's the mosaic phenomenon. Now, what does it look like in the classroom? Dr. Stephen Shore states, if you've met one person with autism, then you've met one person with autism. And I must agree. Starting with language issues. This is myth number 3. People with autism can't communicate. Now, someone who is nonverbal would often be described as severely autistic, since they cannot speak and they may not appear to understand what's going on around them. However, nonverbal autists like Carly Fleischman have taught us that, in fact, they are very socially aware and understand pragmatic speech quite well. For example, in episode 2 of her show Speechless, you can see here, we see her coaxing James Van Der Beek, the actor, into taking his shirt off, which he does, so highly recommend. But this demonstrates an important point. Those who appear less able to communicate can often do so in their own ways, and vice versa. Those who appear completely able to communicate may face another difficulty that they don't quote unquote look autistic, and as a result, their communication difficulties are not taken as seriously. This brings us to misunderstandings. So people on the autistic spectrum who have pragmatic language issues, that is eye contact, for example, body language, minimal pairs, or idioms, phrases such as pull your socks up even, they have difficulty not taking things literally. They may struggle with things like eye contact or body language. A family member of mine was told to pull up his socks if he wanted to do better at school, and he just pulled his socks up. Also, they often complain that people in the neurotypical world don't say what they mean, so this is often an issue for people. Recent studies, interestingly, have shown that high-functioning individuals with autism or Asperger syndrome commonly report difficulties understanding speech in situations where there's background speech or noise. This is often when the noise is oscillating. It might be music or conversation. And this demonstrates that they have difficulty identifying what they should be paying attention to. Now let's talk about social awareness and myth number 4. People with autism don't have emotions. Neurotypical people often get the impression that every autist is like Spock, this kind of removed, distant, cold, unemotional person. However, writers with autism would argue it couldn't be further from the truth. Many document hyper-empathy, that's the inability not to mirror the emotions going on around them. Or they may describe alexithymia. I've never looked up how to pronounce that word, and yet I use it all the time, which would be experiencing an emotion and not being able to identify what it is. And also, they may be having the emotion perfectly fine, and they report having this emotion, but are unaware it's not showing in their face or body language. Also, they may experience emotions that don't track as typically over neurotypical emotions. The writer Tara Vance put it perfectly, I think. While watching the documentary about Ruth Bader Ginsburg, RBG, I had an epiphany. She said, justice and mercy, they're very grand emotions. And it hit me that to me, those are 2 of my deepest felt emotions: justice, equality, fairness, mercy, long-suffering, work, passion, knowledge, and above all else, truth. Those are my primary emotions. Very admirable emotions indeed. So obsessive and unusual interests are relatively common for people on the spectrum. They can often provide comfort and reassurance in a world that isn't necessarily designed for them. However, this can lead to conversations where they're unaware that the listener has lost interest, but luckily people on the autistic spectrum are less likely to be offended by directness. So if you say to them, do you know what, I'm not mad about talking about Star Trek for another hour, it may well work. So this brings us to change rejection. So many on the autistic spectrum have difficulty dealing with change. They can react in ways you might not expect. For example, repetitive actions like flapping. Flapping is the term used for when they move their hands up and down like this, as if they're giving themselves air. They may make noises that are unexpected or inappropriate, supposedly, for the situation. They may retreat into themselves and not react. And they may have a more severe reaction and experience some anxiety. Repetitive or ritualized behaviors are seen as quite common. A family member of mine used to ask you who your hairdresser was, and if you didn't respond the same person every single time, she couldn't talk to you and got quite distressed. So the repetitive speech is called scripting. And it might be, for example, their previous conversations with you, like who your hairdresser was. It might be a line from TV or film. It might be echolalia, which is the repetition of what has directly just been said by you or the other person in the conversation again. It might be voiced out loud, or it might be under their breath. It could be repeated sounds instead of words. Now this brings us to the physical reaction, what's called stimming. So stimming, as I said, is the physical repetitive action and can be seen in the neurotypical population in things like biting your nails, tapping your pen, drumming your nails on the desk, or tapping your foot. For people with ASC, stimming can include rocking back and forth, hand gestures like flapping, as I said before. It can include staring into lights, or more serious actions like hitting or punching themselves or other people, or hitting their head against something repeatedly. Now, someone with autism may be stimming due to stress, frustration. It could be attention seeking, but the reasons behind stimming are individual and should be considered in every occasion. Why is this happening? Consider the diagram. Is it affecting the lesson or classmates? Now, this has come up in personal experience as a teacher myself, where stimming in a supposedly neurotypical student was quite distracting to the class and did in fact slow our progress. So I started to think to myself, this is a reassurance method for him. Should it be stopped? No? And I came up with this. Is it affecting the lesson or classmates? Yes. In that case, you should speak to their support network. Support network are detailed a lot in the literature on children, not so much on adults, but a support network is a support network. It might be their best friend in the class. It might be their parent or guardian. It might be their spouse in the case of a family member of mine. You just need more information about them. Why are they doing that? Do they do that regularly? Just get as much information as you can in order to know how best to react. Is it affecting the lesson or classmates? No. Can it be ignored? No. Then perhaps speak to their support network with less urgency. Can it be ignored? Yes. Then don't draw attention to it. And the reason I say this is that if it's not distracting people and it can be ignored, then stimming is likely serving a positive role and it shouldn't be called out. In my survey, I asked about the learning objectives of students who the teachers believed had ASD and the classmates of these students. 34% responded that they were unaffected by this student being in the class, which complies with the 34% responded NA. This complies with the number of respondents who said that they couldn't be sure if they've had someone with autism in their classroom. 45% responded that the learning objectives of the student with autism and or their classmates had been negatively affected. Let me repeat that, that's 45%. And 22% responded that they had not been affected by this student being in class. Clearly, teachers feel that this is something that can affect the classroom environment and the learning objectives, and they feel like it should perhaps be addressed. They just may not know how. Now, in cases of severe anxiety, you may have a student experiencing what's colloquially called a meltdown, and this brings us to myth number 5. That people with autism throw tantrums. A meltdown is often due to overstimulation. We spoke about stimulation before. This is perhaps sensory stimulation. It could be to do with change, unexpected changes that might be in the classroom, for example. But anyway, it may be hard to have the perspective of someone who's been through this. So we're going to watch a little video from the Mighty to tell you more about what it feels like. Now, a few of those mentioned the buildup of emotions. They also mentioned that there's an explosion or a moment where it all clicks and they lose their filter, for example, this filter being able to block out the things that they are always noticing or always feeling. And if they have the filter in place or the filter is strong, then they can deal with it. If the filter is weak or has disappeared, they can't deal with it. And a few of them mentioned sleep. Now, the concept of energy is often brought up in the community, especially the concept of a social battery. There are things that deplete your battery, and there are things or people which fill your battery. And in the community, it's often talked about as spoons. Have you got any spoons left? Now, I'm sure we've all felt this. If we're tired, if we're run down, there are just some things we can't do well, we can't deal with, we can't talk to that specific person if we're quite tired. This would just be the extreme of that. And there are things that you can do either during or after a meltdown, which may improve this experience for your student and perhaps for those in the room. These things can be done, if not immediately, then certainly much later on, or not much later on, but later on. And the acronym is CHECK. This comes from a training program from the NHS. Communication. Can they communicate what is wrong? If not, they may just be in fugue mode and may need to be left alone. Health. Are they ill or in pain? That may be a contributing factor, although it may not seem so. Environment. Is this person sensitive to touch, noise, light, crowding? If so, you may wish to give them some space. Change, have there been any changes to the following? Surroundings, routines, people, and knowledge, what's normal for this person? Now, I realize I have been talking a lot more than I thought, so I'm just going to very quickly skip forward to unfortunately, I'll include more in further reading, but I'm just going to skip forward to something that I wanted to talk about. So, myth number 6. People on the spectrum are few and not like us. This is from Professor Amanda Kirby, the campaigner for neurodiversity. Around 15% of the population have a range of neurodivergent traits that are different from society's views on of those who are considered to be neurotypical. This is not dichotomous with a hard and fast line that says that you're definitely neurodivergent or definitely neurotypical. It is messy. And in my report, or in my survey, 14% of respondents said that it's very possible that they themselves are on the spectrum, which I found very interesting. Now, remember, this 15% mentioned by Amanda Kirby is for neurodivergency. That includes a range of things under which autism is one. However, I thought that that was quite interesting in a response from the respondents. And let me return to the 6 myths that I mentioned before. That it's on the rise, it's not on the rise. This is more diagnosis and awareness. That it's caused by vaccines. This has been disproven and retracted. That they can't communicate. They can with the correct methods and also understanding from those around them. That they don't experience emotions. They may be different types of emotions and they may experience them differently. That they throw tantrums. This is simply not true. This is a reaction to anxiety and the environment around them. That they are different and separate from the rest of the population. This is not true. People with autism are present in society, and with a little bit of work on the part of people who may not even perceive any difference, they are perfectly understandable. I'll leave you with a final quote from Brenda Smith-Miles, who was rephrasing a quote from nonverbal autist A.M. Baggs. I fail to learn your language and I'm described as having a deficit. You fail to learn my language and I'm described as being mysterious and puzzling. For more information from the autistic perspective, do check out 800 Seconds on Autism on the BBC podcast. You can read the Neuroclastic website for very interesting articles on the autistic perspective. Also on TikTok and on Instagram, there've been really interesting posts from around the world from neurodiverse and neurotypical people on these questions. And here is some further reading. I'm gonna have to send slides because I didn't get in everything I wanted to. But I just wanted to say thank you so much. If you have any further questions, don't hesitate to email me at srabenstein